This is the Duke of Alva's thumb. It's made of bronze. In 1567, the Duke of Alva was sent from Spain to suppress rebellion in the southern Netherlands. He established something that the local people soon called the Council of Blood. Many people died. He persecuted people. He established an inquisition. The problem was that a lot of the people in the southern Netherlands were revolting against the Catholic faith. They'd been converted by Lutheran and Calvinist preachers, and they were moving in a different direction from the faith of the King of Spain, who thought wrongly that he completely ruled them. Alva was sent, as I say, to suppress this rebellion, in the course of which he killed many people, and he built a citadel right next to Antwerp, which is a place thronged with soldiers, a huge garrison, fortified citadel, so that Antwerp could not possibly rebel against him because the soldiers would immediately descend. And in the middle of that citadel, a huge statue of himself, trampling underfoot those Dutch people, Protestants, who would dare to resist him. And after he had been resisted and removed, although the fight was long and hard and it wasn't over when this happened, the citadel was demolished by the citizens of Antwerp and the statue was smashed into 1,000 pieces. Before that happened, Alva had suppressed a place called Zutphen and a place called Naarden, two towns, and he had instructed his soldiers to make sure that no one, no woman, no child, no one survives. So keeping the memory of this was important, and this print is significant because it symbolizes to those people who kept it and who made it, it symbolizes an idea of freedom from the tyranny of Alva and Spain. Alva's thumb came to be owned by a Dutch poet and historian called P.C. Hooft, Peter Cornelis Hooft, who was working and writing in the 1630s and the 1640s while Holland was still at war with Spain, and he was making very sure that everyone remembered the atrocities of the early revolt, because the war had turned into a kind of terrible stalemate. But the atrocities of the early revolt was important to remember them, and this thumb was symbolic and important to him. And he had a friend called Just van Vondel, who's, in a sense, Holland's Shakespeare, most famous playwright. And Vondel knew that his friend had got this thumb, and he had it turned into a print, and he wrote a poem about it. Your hand, meaning you, Hooft, the historian, the Dutch libertarian, your hand now plays with Alva's thumb, but were he still in power, his hand would have played with your head, as with a ball in a game. How brittle and fragile tyranny is. Once you, Alva, had the nation under your thumb. Now your thumb only inspires this poem. The thumb, by the way, has been lost, sadly. But this historical memory of tyranny, which is absolutely, of course, identified with the Dutch sense of liberty and freedom, and Holland was the land of freedom, liberty was the watchword, liberty, 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 long before France had its revolution. They still retain it in the ordinary language of the canals, because every barge post, because the barge posts are black and white, and this was the costume favoured by Alva, they actually, after he'd gone and after he'd buggered off and they felt that they'd actually won their battle, they called their barge posts around which they tied, every boat is tied to one of these, they called them Dukdalfs, which means Duke of Alva. Have you tied your boat up? Yeah, I've tied him to the Duke of Alva. So it still survives today, this memory of freedom and this memory of tyranny. And I'm talking about this because it's, in a sense, it's about how you try to make freedom. How do you create a sense of freedom? You create a sense of freedom by remembering the tyranny that is the opposite of freedom and making sure that it is remembered everywhere. Hooft made sure that his histories of the early atrocities of the Dutch revolt were written in children's language, because he wanted children to read them, even though they're gruesome by the standards of children's literature today. And remembering the gruesomeness of what had happened was very important. Cornelissen, like, this is really early actually in the revolt, but it's in the phase where the Dutch can begin to feel that they're perhaps winning, or at least getting far enough that they've righted the balance of power so that negotiation will take place, and indeed a truce will happen not too long after this picture was painted. But this is Cornelissen's Massacre of the Innocents, and it was painted as a huge kind of secular altarpiece. Well, this painting was actually done for a member of the House of Orange, and it's the only one I could get the slide of. It's an even larger one, which was painted for one of the town halls of Leiden. And it was always there, and it remained always there. And this town hall had an interesting sort of position in the geography of Leiden, because such was the nature of the trekschuit route. Trekschuits are the first proper form of public transport invented by the Dutch, barges drawn by horses. Everybody used them. They ran like buses. They went every 15 minutes, Leiden to Haarlem, and so on and so on. You could get from anywhere to anywhere. If you wanted to get the trekschuit in Haarlem and you came from Delft, you had to go through the town hall. You actually had to walk through it. So you had to see this memory, this supposed religious painting, which is really a memory of what the troops did here. So when the 80 Years' War ends, 1848, in the Dutch Golden Age, which is much more golden after 1648. I hope I said 1648. I meant 1648. It's much more golden after 1648. And these later pictures that we see, they're much misunderstood today, I think. And they were in Ruskin's time. Ruskin said Dutch painting is inherently boring. They painted fogs and ditch water. They painted bricks. They painted the insides of houses. There's no spirituality to Dutch painting. What he, in my opinion, didn't sufficiently recognise was that after the horrors that these people had experienced, after the massacres, after the death, after the astonishing level of upheaval that they had seen, what are they painting when they paint these pictures? They're painting peace. See, this is a mystery, and this is a miracle. A landscape without soldiers in it, a landscape without ruins in it, a landscape where no women are being chased in order to be attacked and assaulted. No children are being killed arbitrarily, thrown into rivers. Men are not being emasculated or tortured to death. It's just a landscape. But that's a miracle in the 1670s. What does freedom mean to these people? You know, these aren't just pictures. This is a painting of benediction. This is freedom as a benediction. And what freedom means is the freedom... I mean, there's freedom froms, if you like. So the landscape is freedom from. What's not in the landscape is the point. The death and the destruction and the famine and the war and the ruined village. What's not, that's the miracle there. Here, it's freedom to. And what's the freedom to? What does that involve? It's the freedom to take care of your child without the fear that somebody at any moment could come in and try and kill you, take over the town, take over your village. It's that freedom. And these paintings radiate, in my view, a sense of the astonishing magic of that freedom to people who haven't known it. And also a sense of how rare it is, this freedom. Because you have to remember that at this point in history, there hasn't just been the 80 Years' War, which was bad, but not that bad after 1610. There's been the 30 Years' War. 1618 to 1648. The worst war in the whole history of Europe, by quite a long way. Statistically, twice as bad as the Second World War. Twice as bad. If you take that area known as the Holy Roman Empire, in those days, Germany, Austria, all the way to Hungary and beyond, probably populated by 21 million people, the 30 Years' War saw it so devastated that agriculture wasn't possible in much of those lands for another 150 years. So devastated that 1/3 of the entire population, 1 in 3 of everybody died. And of those left, virtually every woman who was surviving the 30 Years' War had been violated in some way, and virtually every man was missing some part of their anatomy. So this is a truly terrible war, and that's happening on the very doorstep of Holland. There are accounts. There's an English embassy. He goes, he's the 3rd Earl of Egremont, and he goes from Holland up the Rhine, and everywhere all he sees is death, dead people in churchyards with grass in their mouths. I mean, utter horror. And I think, you know, Rembrandt, this painting of Isaac and Rebecca, everyone in Holland's a refugee. So they fought for their freedom, but they're all refugees. It's like Venice. When Venice established itself at the time of the barbarian invasions, they founded a city. Why did they found a city in somewhere as mad as Venice? Because it was the only place it couldn't be got. That's why Holland is where it is. It's because you can't kill people if they go and settle there, as long as they fortify well enough and they understand the water well enough. An army of 200,000 will find it very difficult to kill 10,000 because they control the water. That's why Holland is where it is. That's why the geography is where it is. And the geography is exactly the same. It hasn't changed. Not a line on the map has changed virtually since 1648. So they're all refugees, and I think that's why Rembrandt paints this picture, this famous picture, Van Gogh's favourite picture, which is the freedom to love. It's the freedom to love. That's what you win by moving there. That's an image. There are very few images of the 30 Years' War and its many atrocities, but Jacques Callot created a series of astonishing prints which touch on it, as well as touching on the history of the wars of religion and the wars of religion in France. But this is one of the most striking images, the Tree of Death, from the great miseries of war. This is the sort of thing that became normality. This was people's normality for 30 years. So, and this is all, in a sense, all of this death is the product, and it's paradoxical, is the product of a fight for freedom, a fight for religious freedom. As Luther nails his theses to the door of Württemberg Cathedral, and the Reformation begins, and the Christian world, having been a single thing for so many centuries, is suddenly split. Are you a Lutheran? And then once, are you a Lutheran or are you a Catholic? What kind of Protestant are you going to be? And this, in the war for freedom, what they provoke upon themselves, if you like, is persecution by the great Catholic powers of the time. So you get these terrible wars of religion and tyrannies that establish themselves in order to keep down the people who want freedom in the first place. And then what happens, which always happens, is that the people who've established the freedom and found their freedom and made their new state, within their ranks spring up a load of people who want to make what they've fought for into a new set of rules and dogmas and doctrines. So the Calvinists tried to take over the Dutch state. As in the case of England, the Church of England does take over the English state and effectively enforces a kind of communist regime here for a very long time, where you cannot do anything. You will be killed if you attempt to worship God in a way that could be construed as Catholic. Whereas the Dutch fight that. They fight it really, really hard. And I think this is why they're so interesting. They challenge the right of the Calvinists to be the only church in town, and they are the first culture in Europe that I know of that practices tolerance and makes tolerance part of freedom, toleration of difference part of freedom. And the most striking, I mean, there'd been attempts within culture to protect, as it were, the freedom of individuals from the tyranny of state religion. There had been attempts earlier. Montaigne saw this happening in France. He saw that these wars of religion were terrible. And I'm sure that's why Montaigne revived the classical ancient Greek notion of skepticism and revived it really effectively. Montaigne basically said, it's the power of I do not know. And Montaigne tried to persuade anyone who would read his writings that you cannot know anything for sure. Why did he argue that so vociferously? Because the world was full of people who thought they knew exactly what the truth was, and that was the problem. And they were killing other people for it and depriving them of liberty. So Montaigne's way of preserving liberty was to try to propound the idea that nobody can ever know anything for sure. That's his great big idea, the power of I do not know, and therefore you do not know, which of course doesn't work with the dogmatic. Another great attempt was made by a group. I've only got a tiny little slide of places where they met, and I think this lot are really fascinating. They're called the Collegiants, and I think they're possibly the most important sect of free thinkers of the early modern period. They were utterly disenchanted with the divisive, schismatic nature of Reformed Christianity, the way in which all these new churches suddenly said, now we've got our own rules. They're not the Catholic rules, but they're rules and you have to obey them. And if you don't, we'll kill you. The Collegiants didn't like this at all. So what the Collegiants did was they went back to a kind of total basics, and they said the great problem with the church and the great problem with organized religion is that it's organized and is that it's a church. So we are going to be Christians without a church. There's a great French book about their movement called Chrétiens sans Église by a Polish guy, actually, called Pierre Kolakowski. So they were going to be Christians without a church. So they had meeting rooms, and the only thing you had to agree to was that in some sense you believed that Jesus Christ was a saviour. You didn't have to believe he was the Son of God. You didn't have to believe a single bit of dogma. You only had to believe that he was a saviour. And then you could come to their meetings. But they weren't a church. There was no organisation. They had no authority. They declared authoritatively that they had no authority. And what grew up in their circle, what was nourished by this astonishing, these meetings, anyone could prophesy, anyone could stand up. And what was, Spinoza was part of them. Spinoza, who believed that, as he said in his ethics, if you boil down Spinoza's ethics to their essential, what they are is the Sermon on the Mount, remade as post-Descartesian philosophy. It's very straightforward. Never make war, love thy neighbour. If somebody kills, which is the hard bit, if somebody kills your child, return love to them. This is Spinoza's philosophy, Spinoza's ethical philosophy. But he has the freedom to develop that philosophy. He's a Jewish guy, and he's in the collegiate circle because he's rejected his own Judaism, and he hasn't embraced Christianity because he doesn't really believe it's metaphysics. He's got his own quite singular metaphysics, but he believes it's ethics. So he develops through that. But all kinds of movements that you find, often people set libertarian freedom movements that are associated with France and the Enlightenment actually begin with the Collegiants. Pacifism, the first pacifists in European culture, the first really serious pacifists are to be found within the ranks of the Collegiants and the Mennonites, the Anabaptists. They have very strong connections. One branch of Mennonites actually dares to declare that the Mennonite church has no authority and it isn't a church anymore, which is an extraordinary thing for a church to do. So the anti-slavery movement, socialism, I would even say. The Collegiants took very seriously Christ's words about the meek inheriting the earth, and feminism. women had as much weight and power in the movement as men, and there were just as many women in the membership. There was no priority of men over women whatsoever. Anarchism, you could say, because it was a totally anarchic arrangement. Sometimes the guy prophesying or a lady prophesying would speak for 20 minutes. Sometimes they'd speak for 6 seconds. Sometimes they'd just scream. And because of its integrity, i.e. it never became a church, and in that sense it's unique among Christian movements that I'm aware of, because of all that, it gradually disappeared. But it left its mark. And that preoccupation with freedom, and I think it's fascinating that draw whatever modern parallels you may, but you get a schismatic outburst of free thinking that then crystallizes into lots of really harsh, hard, polarized, different positions. And then you have this group that says, no, we need to find a way of discovering not what separates us, but what brings us together. What can we agree on? Let's not start with what we disagree on. Let's start with what we agree on. And their preoccupation with freedom and their preoccupation with agreement, or finding some sense of common humanities, finding something that's universal, I think the linkage between those two things is very important, and there's a lot for us in it. I won't say what, because I think that's up to you to think of that. Now, I'm just going to change the subject completely. Well, not completely, but I'm not going to talk about religion. Religion and churches and the way in which they perhaps curtail freedom, but they don't need to, because often the message at the heart of the religion is wonderful and liberating. I personally find that with Christianity. It's the churches that are the problem. Now, something else that is very obstructive to freedom, in my opinion, is a strong sense of national self-determination or national self-importance. So that's why I'm going to talk about this picture, because I think this picture is a monumental attempt to puncture all of that. It's called the Raft of the Medusa, Le Radeau de la Méduse, and it was painted by Théodore Géricault in the second decade of the 19th century, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So in other words, it was painted at the end of another terrible, terrible cycle of death and devastation, brought on more by imperialist ambition than by schismatic religious division. And I was going to, I think a good introduction to this painting and the mood of this painting is Alfred de Musset, who was born, he wrote a book called Confessions of a Child of the Century, which means a child born in 1800. And it's this hugely melancholic outburst, lament for his generation brought up with the dreams of glory of Napoleon, which were then plunged down. And what were they going to do now? What were they going to do now? And he wrote this. During the wars of the empire, while the husbands and brothers were in Germany, anxious mothers brought forth an ardent, pale, nervous generation, conceived between battles, educated amidst the noises of war. Thousands of children looked about with a somber eye while testing their puny muscles. From time to time, their blood-stained fathers would appear, raise them on their gold-laced bosoms, then remount their horses. This was their youth. That's their childhood. The life of Europe was centered in one man. All were trying to fill their lungs with the air he'd breathed. Every year France presented that man with 300,000 of her young men. It was the tax paid to Caesar, and without that troop behind him, he could not follow his fortune. And yet never was there such joy, such life, such fanfares of war in all hearts. Never was there such pure sunlight as that which dried all this blood. Then the moment of disappointment. They were told the war was ended, Caesar was dead, the portraits of Wellington and Blucher were suspended in the consulates and the embassies. Then there seated itself on a world in ruins an anxious youth. All the children were drops of burning blood which inundated the earth. They were born in the bosom of war, for war. For 15 years they dreamed of the snows of Moscow and the sun of the pyramids. They once had in their heads all the world, but now they beheld the earth, the sky, the streets, and all of these were empty, and the bells of parish churches resounded faintly in the distance. Behind them lay a past forever destroyed. Before them the aurora of an immense horizon, the first gleams of the future, and between these two worlds, something like the ocean which separates the old world from young America, something vague and floating, a troubled sea filled with wreckage, traversed from time to time by some distant sail or some ship, and so on. And I think he was thinking of this picture, because this picture, this bleak, disquieting image of men marooned at sea, signalling to a distant ship. It had first been exhibited at the annual Paris Salon 1819, and it came to occupy such a fundamentally central place in the French Romantic imagination that I'm sure de Musset made it into a kind of image of the terrible world that they had inherited. That they were all lost. They were all lost. In this painting, which looks like, and was certainly inspired by Michelangelo's Last Judgment. It's a kind of last judgment on his own culture by Géricault, I suspect. It was based on a really unpleasant story, a real-life shipwreck. In 1816, a ship called La Méduse, which was the flagship of a convoy travelling to the French colony of Senegal, became grounded in sandbanks near the west coast of Africa. The captain, whose fault it was, made everything worse by taking the few lifeboats for himself and his senior officers, leaving more than 150 passengers and crew to fend for themselves on a makeshift raft formed from lengths of mast, lashed together with rigging. As they were adrift on the sea, and this was all written up by two survivors, and this is how Géricault knew the story, as they were adrift on the sea with barely any food, their numbers dwindled. Some perished by falling through the gaps of the raft and drowning. A lot died in a battle over the limited supplies of food and water, while others, weakened by hunger, thirst, and exposure, were just simply thrown overboard to preserve the dwindling rations, although those who survived did also keep some of the corpses and cannibalized them in order to survive. So it was grim and dreadful. And from this tale, I mean, Géricault left out almost all the specifics, all the anecdote. He made it into an image that somehow has the feeling of something universal. He thought originally, he thought he might play with the moment of rescue. He thought he might depict the battle. But in the end, he decided that he would paint the hailing, the moment when these people all seem suspended between hope and despair. There's another. Took him 2 years to paint it. So the essential subject is a universal human predicament, suffering, the struggle to survive, and the search to be saved, whether you're a sinner or sinned against. And I think it's important, to cut a long story short, I think it's important that the figure at the apex of Géricault's pyramid, the man waving the tattered rag that is the distress signal, should be one of 3 black men on the raft. And it's very, very striking. And it's more striking, it would have been more striking then perhaps than it is to us now, because the tradition which Géricault's painting occupies is that of the monumental propagandistic French history painting that trumpets the gloire of France. And you do not see black people in those paintings. They do not appear, other than perhaps as slaves. But here, he's at the apex, and he's signalling. And I think this is partly because Senegal, which was the destination of the frigate Medusa, had for centuries been a centre of the slave trade, which was, as Jericho said, it was a dirty business, which I hate. So it's possibly for that reason that he's placed him there. But I don't think that's the only reason. I don't think it's the main reason. I think he's there to emphasise, really emphasise, that the men on the raft stand for all humanity, everybody, regardless of colour or creed. They are us. They are all of us. That's the point. People tried at the time to make it into a political painting. Jericho completely was outraged by the articles that he read doing that, saying that he was on the left wing or the right wing. And he said, no, it's nothing to do with that. The wretches who write such nonsense have never gone without food for 2 weeks on end, otherwise they would realise that neither poetry nor painting can ever do justice to the horror and the anguish of the men on the raft. I think his remarks go to the centre of it all, which is empathy. He wasn't trying to score a point. He wasn't trying to make any kind of propaganda claim. If there was a moral to be... I think he was making a picture that was about the predicament of this time. If there was a moral to be drawn from these years of Napoleon's ascendancy and his defeat, it was that people needed now to rouse themselves from disillusionment, disappointment, and to find space for something else, something that isn't de Musset's fanfares of war. They needed, in his opinion, I think this is what the painting's saying, to recover a sense of fellow feeling and to put pity and love in place of hatred, and to have an idea of how to make a remedy than to conquer, and to see that as a form of freedom. It isn't a painting to be interpreted. It's a place to be occupied. It's not inviting. It's threatened by waves, stormy skies, tossed around by misfortune. But if we don't stand on it, how can we ever hope to rediscover our empathy? I think that was Jericho's message. Stand on the raft. Feel what suffering is. Relieve it rather than adding to it. Feel what is common to all of us. And it's all the more powerful because, as I said, it was painted within this language of propagandistic painting. It's an enormous thing. It's an enormous, they called them grandes machines in France. And I'll give you, that's a good example, painted by an artist whom Jericho, admired. And this is what such pictures look like. It's Napoleon actually ineffectively, Baron Gros, who painted these propaganda paintings, committed suicide, so he wasn't necessarily a propagandist who entirely believed in the propaganda that he was asked to paint, and you can possibly sense that in the scale of the dead bodies. Napoleon is triumphing on this battlefield, but is he really? Look at the number of frozen dead. But that's the tradition. And what Jericho's painting says is, let's have an end to that. Let's have an end to these grandes machines. Let's have an end to these grand heroic statements of national destiny dressed up in the language of history painting. No more fancy dress epics like the Lebrun paintings for Louis XIV, Jacques-Louis David's paintings for the French Revolution, by Gros for his leader, Napoleon. And these pictures would be painted again. Those pictures would be painted in Mao's Russia, Stalin's China, but only under duress and never really with conviction. I think Jericho killed that off by painting the ultimate example of a supposedly nationalistic painting and robbing it of all nationalistic feeling. It's a picture that says, forget division. Remember what we have in common. Remember our humanity. If we can free ourselves from our narrowness, and nationalism is one of the most narrowing of feelings, then we can free ourselves into humanity. And if we can do that, then perhaps we can learn to do the right thing. Change the subject. When I saw this photograph about 2 or 3 years ago, I thought, oh, he's going to do it. There's no doubt. He's going to do it. This is Vladimir Putin. Seemed to go without many people noticing it. erecting an 82 feet high sculpture of Vladimir the Great of Kiev. And it's not exactly in an inconspicuous part of Russia. Now, opponents of liberty, I think that was the theme of what I was talking about in terms of the Dutch revolt as well. Tyranny begins with a tyranny of memory and a controlling of memory. But if it doesn't begin with it, it certainly insists on it. That's why so many totalitarian regimes are so preoccupied with memory and changing memory, erasing memory, altering memory, trying to obliterate it, or killing everybody who's got the wrong memories, the inconvenient memories. And this statue is a form of enacted tyrannical memory. That's what it is. Vladimir I, and this is why Putin unveiled the statue with the head of the Orthodox Church in Russia. They were together. Vladimir I, who was the ruler of Kievan Rus between 980 and 1015, he cast around for a way to unify the different tribes of Kievan Rus and settled on Christianity. And he famously sent diplomats out of Kiev to travel, and he sent some of them to Rome and some of them to Constantinople. And they made a choice: which religion shall we embrace? And his envoys said, well, Rome was pretty good, but Byzantium, fantastic. So that's why there's a huge Byzantine cathedral in the middle of Kiev, because that's where he brought Christianity to, and he united the peoples of Kievan Rus. What happened after that was that the Mongols invaded and expelled all of those people, and they ended up going to found a new civilization up in Russia. And at various points in their history, of course, Ukraine, the area around the Black Sea where Kiev is and so on, has been under Russian control. And this is why Tolstoy has a famous saying. He says, St. Petersburg is the brain of Russia, Moscow is the heart of Russia, but Kiev is the mother of Russia. And I quoted that once in a television series I made about the history of Russian art, and instantly got a furious letter from the Ukrainian embassy in London saying, how dare you quote Tolstoy saying that? It's absolutely wrong. It's a historical myth. It's inaccurate. We are not the mother of Russia. We have nothing to do now with Russia. This isn't, but of course, when I saw this statue, I knew what he had to invade. I mean, it's such a clear statement. He's going to invade. He's not going to do anything else. That statue's like a missile. Because he's going to insist on that one little part of Kiev and Russia and the Ukraine's past, and not a little part, but that one part. Because the truth is, like any area of human geography, it's been many, many things since 1015. It's been many, many things. It's been ruled by the Mongols. It's been under the control of many different groups of people. But it's in the interest of the tyrant to remember only the one piece of history that suits it. And in remembering that one piece of history, he's then essentially telling, and I think in a sense he was gambling on the idea that the Ukrainians perhaps believed it themselves and would suddenly rise up and say, yes, we are Russians. In fact, we are the mother of Russia. We are, and always will be. And they didn't, because they choose not to identify like that. And I would say that the truth is that they're right. And what the tyrant is, and this is where state tyranny and individual tyranny or liberty seem to me to overlap is see, if you have I don't know if anybody's seen a program on the television called Who Do You Think You Are? The people are presented with information about their ancestry. And what happens is, inevitably and invariably, and it's television, and why not, what will happen is that somebody will discover something that they're interested in, and they pick that story. So if it's their great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was doing something, I don't know, he was involved in the Crimean War. They'll go off and they'll make a whole thing where they follow his life, and then it'll be. But what people forget, that's what in a sense, that's what Putin's doing. Because yes, there was that great-great-great-great-great-grandfather who was involved in the Crimean War. But there were 512 other ancestors who you've completely forgotten about. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512. So you can remember the one story that you like, that suits you, and you forget all the other stories. And there's a lot of that goes around. And it's to do with identity and how we choose to shape our identities. And we do so in a very potentially limited and limiting way. This is a set of choices you get given when you fill out a form. This is an NHS form, as I remember. Which of these best describes your ethnic group? Now, it comes from a well-meaning desire to recognise the difference between peoples. But what it does is it encourages people not to understand the reality, which is that everyone, actually, every single person in this room should be ticking every bloody box. Every box applies to all of us. I had this as a kind of revelation because, so what I'm interested in is what brings us all together. How can we heal difference? How can we be free to see each other without these barriers that we keep seeing each other as, oh, you're one of them, you're one of them. I'm one of these, you're one of those. Let's try and get along, even though we're separate from each other. No, we're not. We're all the same. I did my DNA for a program, so it wasn't something I did out of leisure, but I mean, I did my own DNA and I had it reported on. And it turned out, apparently this is fairly predictable. I was 83%, 85%, I haven't got my glasses, they're not big enough, 85% European, 11% East Asian, 4% Sub-Saharan African, 0% Native American. And when I did a drill down of your EuroDNA, because EuroDNA is quite complicated, it turned out Northern European, 60%, South, 12%, etc., etc., etc. And what's interesting about these things is that they give you there are no names attached to any of this. This is just gradual build-up, or possibly sudden build-up. So 4% Sub-Saharan African could potentially mean that my great-great-grandparent was actually a black person from Africa, or it could mean that there were lots and lots of people in my general ancestry who had lots and lots of Sub-Saharan African genetic material and background. You've got no way of knowing. So it's very impersonal. And so you don't have an option of choosing which part of your DNA you want to identify with. But what it the guy said, he said to me, it's not that untypical of a white European British person. It's much more characteristic of somebody probably from Turkey or Spain, someone somewhere a bit closer to Africa than Britain, but, it's not out. Because actually, in the end, everybody's got a bit of this, and you go back, everybody's got a bit of everybody in them. We are all related to one another. And this came to me as a kind of revelationary way of understanding what we have in common and what brings us together. Because we tell ourselves stories about who we are, and then we get reminded of the vastness of history. I mean, the chap who took my sample, he said, you know, think of it this way. When you're born, a light goes on. Take a globe and imagine a pinprick of light in London, you know, on the day you're born. Then your parents, imagine 2 pinpricks of light. One's in Cardiff, the other one's in London. Then 4 pinpricks of light. Then 8 pinpricks of light. Then 16. Then by the time you've got back to, say, 1600, where I began, you've got 2 million ancestors. That's mathematics, and that's genetics. So you've got 2 million ancestors. And he said, so by the time you go back to that period, no matter what colour anybody's skin is now, and by the way, skin colours are not a very accurate determinant of genetic origin. It's like 2 out of 10. But anyway, whatever you think you are, you know, you're everything. And you're only going back to 1600, which is tiny in the history of humanity. And I remember doing this test. In the course of doing this test, I was doing it. The premise of the program was to take some people who confessed, admittedly, that they were racist, and to see if this information and the process of having themselves tested would perhaps shift them from their racist positions. And amazingly, it did. And I remember one young guy particularly who was, you know, admitted that he was quite racist and was about to go off and fight in Afghanistan. He discovered that, like all of us, he had, you know, genetic material from here, there, and everywhere. And as it happened, quite a lot from Afghanistan. And he said not only was he not going to fight, you know, he was not going to fight in Afghanistan, but I remember he's very touchingly, he's just said, well, if everybody knew this information, no one would be a racist, because you can't be, because we're all the same as each other. And I think that this, I don't think personally that this is sufficiently understood. I know it's, if anyone here who is an expert on genetic, you know, matters will think, oh, well, I knew this all already, but I didn't, and I think lots and lots and lots of people don't. And I think it's one of the things, you know, those lights going on. If people knew about those lights going on, I think they'd feel a great sense of liberation. And I found it very liberating to find, you know, to find that my own DNA, to actually understand properly what it all means. And I thought, well, where do those lights ultimately take us? You know, where do those lights lead to? These are the caves of Altamira. There's a cave in Altamira which has got a picture of a horse at one end and a picture of a horse at the other end. And it once had horses everywhere, but they've been rather lost to time and fading. And the horse at one end was done 6,000 years ago, and the horse at the other end was done 26,000 years ago. So in other words, for 20,000 years, that's 7 times as long as the ancient Egyptian empire lasted, 20,000 years, those people continued to worship their horses in some form, in some way that we don't understand. And those people, according to the archaeological record, never fought. They never fought. There's been no discoverable find of a skeleton from that period, human skeleton, which shows wounding or harm. So that's where I choose to find my sense of liberation, touching those hands, those hands were painted by somebody filling their mouth with pigment and then going and leaving that mark. They're women's hands, by the way. Lots of those who know think that quite probably all of the Lascaux and Altamira paintings were done by women, because it would make sense in the ecology of work that women should do the painting. So anyway, yes, as I say, I think that those hands, which I suppose in a sense a little bit like the hands of the people on the Raft of the Medusa, except the people on the Raft of the Medusa are looking for salvation. And I think if we think a great deal about these hands, and perhaps if we think about the fact of our common origins a bit more than we do on a daily basis. Perhaps these hands can offer us a bit of salvation. Thank you very much.